In the summer of 1918, in a Russia being torn apart by revolution, an entire imperial family, the Romanovs, rulers of a sixth of the world's landmass, just vanished. For decades, whispers and rumors haunted the world about what happened to them. Did they escape their Bolshevik captors? Were they secretly living in exile? Or did they meet a much darker end? The truth, when it was finally pieced together, was more brutal, more calculated, and more tragic than anyone had imagined. For almost 100 years, one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century was protected by a wall of government silence and deliberate lies. This is the story of not just a disappearance, but a meticulously planned execution, a political cover-up meant to erase a dynasty from history, and the incredible scientific quest that finally brought their gruesome fate to light. The Gilded Cage. Before their fall, it's hard to even wrap your head around just how powerful and wealthy the Romanovs were. Tsar Nicholas II ruled the vast Russian Empire, a dynasty that had stood for 300 years. Their life was one of opulence that's difficult to comprehend today. Palaces with rooms paneled in amber, Fabergé eggs given as casual Easter gifts, and imperial yachts that were basically floating palaces. Nicholas, his German-born wife Serena Alexandra, and their 5 children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the fragile heir Alexei lived a life of gilded isolation, completely set apart from the millions of people they ruled. But under the surface of this perfect royal portrait, the foundations were cracking. Nicholas II, by his own admission, never even wanted to be Tsar. He was a devoted family man, but as a ruler, he was indecisive and totally out of touch with a rapidly changing world. His wife, Alexandra, was deeply unpopular, seen as a cold and controlling German on the Russian throne. Her desperation to heal their only son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, a secret disease that meant a simple bruise could kill him, drew her to the mystic Grigory Rasputin. To the royal couple, Rasputin was a holy man sent by God. To the Russian public, he was a source of scandal and outrage, destroying what little trust was left in the monarchy. They were a family that was both incredibly powerful and profoundly vulnerable, living in a palace while a revolutionary storm was gathering just outside the gates. The end of an empire. Then in 1914, the storm finally broke. Russia's entry into World War I was a total cataclysm. The unprepared nation suffered staggering losses, with millions of soldiers and civilians dying. The war crippled the economy, which led to massive food shortages and fueled a rage that swept across the empire. The people, who had suffered for so long under the Tsar, were now starving and losing their sons in a brutal, pointless war. The Romanov name became the symbol for all the nation's suffering. In March 1917, they hit the breaking point. The February Revolution exploded in the capital Petrograd. With his power collapsing and his armies turning on him, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne. And just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule came to a sudden, quiet end. The Tsar, who had once commanded an empire, was now just Nicholas Romanov, a citizen and a prisoner. He and his family were put under house arrest, their world shrinking from a massive empire to the grounds of the Alexander Palace. They weren't rulers anymore. They were captives of a new, radical government, and their future was completely uncertain. From palace to prison, the family's first taste of captivity was a strange kind of limbo. They were held at the Alexander Palace, still surrounded by familiar luxuries, but without any of their freedom. As things in Russia got more and more volatile, the government decided to move them, for their own safety, deep into Siberia. In August 1917, the Romanovs were sent to the remote town of Tobolsk. There, they lived in the old governor's mansion, a far cry from their palaces, but still relatively comfortable. They kept a routine. Nicholas chopped wood, the children had lessons, and they put on plays to pass the time, all while clinging to the hope of a rescue that would never happen. But then, The October Revolution of 1917 swept the more radical Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, into power. Their captivity took a dark and ominous turn. In late April of 1918, the family was moved again, this time to the industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were imprisoned in a merchant's house that had been seized by the local Bolsheviks. The windows were painted over, high walls were built, and machine gun nests were set up. The Bolsheviks gave it a chilling name, the House of Special Purpose. Here, life became a real prison. The guards were hostile and crude. Their belongings were constantly searched, and their isolation was total. They were forbidden from speaking any language but Russian and were always being watched. The family, along with their loyal doctor, a footman, a maid, and a cook who had chosen to follow them, lived under a cloud of constant dread. The Russian Civil War was now raging between Lenin's Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Army. The White forces were getting closer to Yekaterinburg, and the local Bolsheviks grew paranoid that the Romanovs could be rescued and used as a powerful symbol to rally support for the monarchy. The family's very existence had become a problem for Lenin, and in the brutal math of revolution, there was only one permanent solution: the House of Special Purpose. By early July 1918, you could feel the menace thickening inside the House of Special Purpose. The old guards were replaced by secret police, hand-picked for their fanatical loyalty. Command of the house was given to a man named Yakov Yurovsky, a stern and merciless Bolshevik who would orchestrate the family's final moments. He was under direct orders to prevent the Romanovs' rescue at all costs. As the White Army drew closer, a decision was made in Moscow. While there's no paper trail leading directly to Vladimir Lenin, it's widely believed the order came with his approval. The Romanovs were to be liquidated. Yurovsky began his preparations with chilling efficiency. He found a remote spot in the Kopyaki forest, a collapsed mine shaft, where he planned to get rid of the bodies. He ordered large amounts of gasoline and sulfuric acid to be brought to the house tools, to make sure the victims could never be identified. On July 16th, Yurovsky dismissed the young kitchen boy, Leonid Sednev. It was a small, strange act of mercy on a night that would have none. The family had no idea they had just eaten their last meal together. The final night. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, around 2 a.m. Yurovsky woke the Romanovs and their 4 attendants. He told them there was trouble in town and they needed to move to the basement for their own safety. The family, used to being moved and still hoping for rescue, did as they were told without protest. Nicholas carried his frail son, Alexei, in his arms. They got dressed, grabbed a few pillows, and followed their captors down a narrow staircase into a small, empty basement room. They were told to wait, that a truck was coming for them. Alexandra complained that there were no chairs, so 2 were brought in for her and Alexei. Nicholas stood near his son, with his daughters and their 4 loyal servants, Dr. Botkin, maid Anna Demidova, footman Alexei Trapp, and cook Ivan Karatonov standing behind them. They waited in the silent, cramped room for several minutes, with a growing sense of confusion and fear. Then, Yakov Yurovsky and a squad of armed executioners filed into the room. He stepped forward and quickly read from a piece of paper, announcing that the Ural Soviet of Workers' Deputies had decided to execute them. Nicholas, stunned, turned to his family and managed to say, "What? What?" He barely got the words out. Yurovsky immediately raised his pistol and shot the Tsar at point-blank range. That was the signal. The other executioners opened fire, a chaotic and deafening hail of bullets in the small room. The space filled with smoke and screams. The execution was a complete mess. When the smoke cleared, several of the children were still alive. The daughters had sewn family jewels into their clothes, which acted as makeshift armor, deflecting the bullets. In a panic, the executioners moved in with bayonets and rifle butts to finish the slaughter. It was a scene of unspeakable brutality that took a horrifying 20 minutes to end. By the time it was over, 11 people lay dead in the blood-soaked basement. The Romanov dynasty was over. The disappearance and the cover-up. But the murder was only part one of the plan. Part two was just as crucial, the cover-up. The Bolsheviks knew that murdering the entire imperial family, especially the children, would cause outrage at home and around the world. It could turn the Romanovs into martyrs and strengthen the White Army. So they engineered a disappearance. A few days after the massacre, an official announcement was made. Nicholas Romanov, the Bloody Tsar, had been executed because of the threat of his rescue. But the announcement falsely claimed his wife and son had been moved to a secure location. The daughters weren't mentioned at all. For the next 8 years, the Soviet government spun a web of lies, sometimes hinting the family was dead, other times denying it. This deliberate confusion was meant to rob the monarchist movement of a clear story. Meanwhile, Yurovsky and his men were busy with the gruesome task of erasing the evidence. They loaded the bodies onto a truck and drove them to the mine shaft in the Kapyaki forest. They stripped the bodies of their clothes and jewels, doused them with sulfuric acid, and threw them into the mine. But the shaft was too shallow. Worried they'd be discovered, Yurovsky ordered the bodies retrieved the next day. The truck got stuck in the mud on a path called Pig's Meadow. There, under the cover of darkness, they made a final, desperate decision. They dismembered and burned 2 of the bodies, later identified as Alexei and one of his sisters, and buried them in a separate spot. The remaining 9 bodies were doused in acid again and buried in a mass grave right under the road, hoping they would never be found. The Romanovs had vanished, swallowed by the Siberian forest and a government-sponsored lie. The ghost of Anastasia. But the Bolsheviks' secrecy had an unintended side effect. It created a legend. Because there were no bodies and no official confirmation of their deaths, rumors of survivors began to fly. And one name, above all others, became the heart of a decades-long mystery. Anastasia, the youngest, most spirited of the Tsar's daughters, became a symbol of hope and survival against all odds. Over the years, dozens of women came forward claiming to be the lost Grand Duchess. The most famous of them all was a woman who came to be known as Anna Anderson. She appeared in Berlin in 1920 after a suicide attempt and was put in an asylum with no memory. When another patient noticed she looked like the Romanovs, the story took off. Anna Anderson seemed to have an intimate knowledge of court life, had scars she claimed were from the execution, and looked remarkably like Anastasia. She convinced many people, including some who had known the imperial family, and her story became an international sensation. For over 60 years, she fought a legal battle in German courts to be recognized as Anastasia. While most Romanov relatives insisted she was a fraud, her story captured the world's imagination. It was a romantic tale of a lost princess, a mystery born directly from the Soviet cover-up. The world wanted to believe that at least one person had survived the horror of that basement. The legend of Anastasia kept the mystery alive for most of the 20th century. So how do you disprove a myth that powerful? The answer was buried in a Siberian forest, waiting for history and science to finally catch up. If you're fascinated by this mystery, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next investigation into the stories that time forgot. The skeletons in the forest. For decades, the truth stayed buried, literally. But in Yekaterinburg, local rumors about the secret grave never completely went away. In the 1970s, a local geologist named Alexander Avdonin and a filmmaker, Zhely Ryabov, started a secret investigation based on Yurovsky's private notes. In 1979, risking serious punishment from the Soviet government, they found the shallow pit under the old Kapyaki road. They dug up a few skulls, but terrified of the consequences, they reburied them and swore to stay silent until the political climate changed. That change came with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Avdonin went public, and Russian authorities officially excavated the site. They found a mass grave with 9 skeletons. The bones were jumbled and damaged by acid, but the forensic investigation began. It confirmed the remains belonged to 5 females and 4 males. The world watched, holding its breath. Was this the Romanov family? And if it was, where were the other 2? The initial findings seemed to confirm the Anastasia myth. Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters were missing from the grave. So instead of being solved, the mystery had just entered a whole new scientific phase. The final proof. To get a final answer, scientists turned to what was then a revolutionary new tool, DNA analysis. In a groundbreaking international effort, forensic scientists compared mitochondrial DNA from the skeletons to living relatives of the Romanovs. For the Tsarina and her daughters, a DNA sample was provided by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose grandmother was Alexandra's sister. The result was a perfect match. The bones belonged to the Tsarina and 3 of her daughters. Identifying the Tsar was trickier, but a comparison with the remains of his dead brother also confirmed a match. The science was undeniable. The skeletons were the Romanovs and their staff. But the question remained, what happened to Alexei and the missing daughter? For years, the legend of Anastasia's survival lived on, fueled by that empty space in the grave. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in 2007. A group of amateur archaeologists, inspired by the earlier discovery, found a second, smaller grave just 70 meters away. It contained the burned, fragmented remains of 2 bodies, matching Yurovsky's account of a separate burial. Once again, DNA experts went to work. They confirmed the remains belonged to a boy and a young woman, and then compared their DNA to the remains from the first grave. The results were irrefutable. The children in the second grave belonged to the Tsar and Tsarina. DNA would eventually confirm the remains belonged to Sios, Alexei, and his sister Maria. After 90 years of rumor, conspiracy, and heartbreak, science had provided the final, conclusive proof. The entire Romanov family died in that basement. And that powerful DNA evidence delivered one last twist. It proved once and for all that Anna Anderson was not Anastasia Romanov, but a Polish factory worker named Franziska Shanskowska. The myth was finally put to rest. So, the Romanovs didn't just disappear. They were systematically, secretly erased. Their execution was a political act, carried out with brutal efficiency to make sure the monarchy could never come back. The cover-up that followed was a deliberate campaign of lies that created a mystery that lasted almost a century. It's a mystery that was ultimately solved not by spies or storytellers, but by geologists, archaeologists, and scientists who pieced together the truth from shattered bones and strands of DNA. In 1998, 80 years after their murder, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were laid to rest in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. It was a moment of national reckoning for Russia, though the remains of Alexei and Maria, found later, still wait for their final burial. The story of the Romanovs is a stark reminder of the violent changes of the 20th century. It's a story about the brutal fall of an empire, the cruelty of revolution, and the incredible power of a myth. But above all, it's the human tragedy of one family, a father, a mother, and their 5 children, who went from being the absolute rulers of a nation to prisoners in a basement, their lives wiped out in a moment of cold, calculated violence. If you found this look into a century-long mystery as fascinating as we did, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more deep dives into the most compelling and enigmatic stories from history. Thanks for watching.